After a night of turmoil and unanswered questions, what's the real story behind the gun that changed hands? And who is the actual target of the werewolf's hunt? With Bray's gaze fixed on Samantha, will Samuel be able to protect her from the pack's growing animosity and the unseen danger lurking in the shadows? Join our pack. Subscribe to start your adventure. Chapter 47 for now. With the end of our conversation, I believed Samuel would immediately leave the room. However, he tiredly backed away and sat down in the armchair next to Marshall's desk. Then he looked at me warily. Bray's going to be throwing accusations out about you being human and with the gun. I'm going to try and isolate him, but I don't know if it's going to work. I'll bring you to the room next to Will and hopefully, everything will be sorted out in the morning. I nodded then paused. A memory from the night resurfaced and refused to go unnoticed. Samuel, there's something else about the gun. I slowly started thinking back to Cade and his brother. Samuel looked at me, raising one of his eyebrows. Yes, Cade told me something and it doesn't make sense. I've tried thinking about it, but no matter what, something is off. I tilted my head to the side, staring at the floor between us as if it held the answers. I hesitated, and when I did, Samuel let out a sharp breath. Well, what is it? Well, Cade told me that the wolves already caught up with his group and him and his brother were just trying to escape. The way he talked made it seem like the others were already caught. Samuel shrugged. The gesture was supposed to be nonchalant, but tension laced his shoulders. He could have been lying. What does this have to do with the gun? He said that the gun he had was the last one left. The wolves took them all when they captured and killed everyone when we were taken. Samuel was quiet for a long time. He adopted an unreadable expression and held his fingers together against his nose. When he finally did speak, he kept his gaze trained on the floor. How do you know he wasn't lying? I bit my lip. I don't. Then, who shot at us if the humans didn't have guns? My shoulders sagged. I don't know. Nothing makes sense. Samuel shifted, opening and closing his mouth several times before eventually getting his words out. Look, Samantha. What you're saying could be true. But the humans have come after us before. They've lied before. It was just a few hours ago they killed half a dozen of us. It doesn't make sense, though, I quickly countered. Everyone has a different story. How could the humans have gotten to us if Bray was hunting them? How could they have shot at us if they didn't have any guns? How did they get away so fast? Why didn't you hear them before? Samuel put up a hand, ending my slew of questions. I don't have the answers, Samantha. Well, what do you think they are? He rested his elbows on his knees and pressed the tips of his fingers to the bridge of his nose. He stayed in that position for a long time, closing his eyes and letting emotion roll away from his features. I hated this new part of Samuel, the one that hid everything he felt. It was so different from the person I initially met. It used to be that I could tell exactly what he was thinking by the look on his face. Now he was hiding everything. It doesn't make sense, he eventually agreed, opening his eyes. I don't know about the part if we took their guns or not. I haven't seen any. But Riley stopped telling me things after all that happened. He sighed. All I know is what you've told me, what Bray told me, and now what some human said. I tried to catch his gaze and failed. None of the stories are adding up. It was true, nothing made sense. If it wasn't the werewolves, it couldn't have been the humans. If what Cade was saying was true, then they had no guns to even fire at us. They'd practically been caught by the time Cade left them. If this was the case and Cade had no reason to lie to me, they wouldn't have been able to escape a dozen werewolves hunting them down, much less run to the forest to shoot at us. Then again, I'd been betrayed by Cade before. I phrased my next words carefully, sorting through my thoughts out loud. Maybe it wasn't the humans. Samuel paused. James. I shook my head, though somewhat uncertain. What motive would he have? He couldn't have done it alone. Maybe he wasn't alone. I closed my eyes and tugged on the loose ends of my hair. For so long I believed everything that was going wrong was because of Riley. I was convinced he'd somehow bit my brother and taken my mother. After all, Riley's goal was for Samuel and me to be each other's worlds. It very well could be that he had done all of that, but now I realized there was something else happening. The shooting had been an attack on all of us, including Riley. Someone else was out there and something larger was going on. You really think it was him? I don't know what to think, Samantha. Samuel let out a heavy sigh, his body falling deeper into the chair. My head fell to my chest and I let out a ragged breath. Why would anyone even want to attack us? He pursed his lips, clear thoughts running across his face. However, he didn't voice them. He only told me, "You don't need to worry, Samantha. I'll fix it." Not everything's fixable, I sighed, suddenly feeling the weight of oceans crash down upon me. Unexpected tears pricked at my eyes, but I forcefully pushed them back. There should be no reason for me to cry right now. No reason, apart from the fact that my family was missing. I'd almost died again tonight, and I was no closer to fixing anything than I was when this whole mess started. Samuel shifted his weight, and after a moment's hesitation, he left his chair and sat on the desk with me. His large hand found its way to my knees, just as I pulled them up to my chest. I was tempted to lean into Samuel, but I stayed rooted in place and told myself it was exhaustion drawing me nearer to him, simply the need for a surface to sleep on. He softly continued speaking, comforting me with his words instead. "Everything's going to be fine. Will's going to be fine. Your mother will be fine." He paused, hesitantly reaching forward to turn my face to him. "We'll be fine. We will figure out who did this. You don't need to worry. I'll fix it. You've been through enough, Samantha. You don't have to fix everything, Samuel." He shook his head softly. "When it was me who caused the mess, yes, I do." I turned my gaze away and Samuel let go of my cheek. "We've both to blame here. We've established that." He opened his mouth to counter my response, but I spoke over him, quickly changing the subject. "Besides, you try and fix everything." He tilted his head. "Everything? That's a bit of an exaggeration." "Definitely not." He softly snorted. "Agree to disagree." A small smirk played on his lips, begging for me to contradict him. I shifted my weight, raising an eyebrow and pointing a finger at his chest. "No, I'm definitely right. What about Will?" "I didn't fix Will." I folded my arms, sending him a pointed look. "You fixed his hospital room." Samuel shrugged my comment off, looking around the small office. When I realized he wasn't going to respond, I smirked. "I rest my case." He looked back at me, holding back a wide grin. "You're right. Ima fixe." "I know I'm right." Samuel's shoulders shook with his small laugh. A genuine smile threatened to break through my features, but for some reason I held it back. Eventually, Samuel patted my knee and sighed. "You need rest." "So do you." He sneered suddenly, catching my eye. "Care to join me?" I scoffed, rolling my eyes dramatically. "In your dreams, Wolf Boy."
"Always, Sammy."
"That's not my nickname. That's yours. I've heard 2 people use it now." Samuel beamed. "Who's to say I can't share?" Another smile threatened to spread across my face. Samuel was already grinning broadly, waiting for me to follow. Instead of giving him the satisfaction, I turned my face away and buried my gaze into my other knee. He laughed once before standing and stretching out his hand, letting it linger in the air for me. When I didn't take it, he rolled his eyes. "It's a hand, Samantha. It's not going to shoot." I scowled, though I scooted off the desk and took his outstretched palm. "That's not funny." He shrugged. "You've got to find humor somewhere. Come on." He tightened his grip, pulling me close to him so I wouldn't fall. "I've got a room for you next to Will." Samuel once again half carried me through the halls. I'm sure if my wound hadn't been on my side, he would have insisted on carrying me over his shoulder. Like before, I lost track of the number of doors we passed and hallways we crossed. Only when we descended a flight of stairs did I recognize the grandiose living room coming into view. With it came the rumbling of voices and shuffling of countless feet running across the hardwood floors. We came to the bottom of the stairs, but before Samuel could lead us to another hallway, he was stopped by a loud voice calling out his name. When it did, the room stopped moving. Everybody paused their movements and turned to face the person who'd called out their beta's name. Up until this point, none of them even knew Samuel was here. Now there was no avoiding it. It didn't take the crowd long to find us, and soon, it felt like hundreds of eyes were staring into my soul. "Samuel," the voice of Peyton Bray called out again. The steel tone echoed through the room, sending chills across the once cozy furniture. "How nice of you to finally join us." Samuel shifted me so that I was slightly behind him and away from prying eyes. "It's beta to you, Bray." Samuel's tone matched Bray's in every aspect. "Is it?" Bray called out. That's what we'd all like to know, after all. The room was devoid of any noise. The two men's voices echoed across the walls, bouncing back and forth, demanding any and all attention. Samuel eyed the room, stiffening as he held me with one of his arms. For now. A few gasps were heard, and the crowd started to murmur. Countless cries of "Where's the alpha?" and "What happened?" pierced the group. Before they could get carried away, Samuel raised his hand, and everything silenced once more. "I will answer any and all questions you have. For now, let us tend to the wounded and help one another through the night." "What about the dead?" Bray's voice rose above Samuel's. "Shouldn't you be hunting the ones that killed them?" Peyton's eyes narrowed. "It seems you're already hiding one behind our backs." Again, low voices surrounded us. Bray's words were being taken to heart, and I could suddenly feel an entire pack of werewolves bearing down on me. Their glares, their contempt, their confusion was all I could sense. It surrounded me in a cocoon, threatening to squeeze the life from my body. Samuel hugged me reassuringly. "Samantha has hurt no one, and she does not intend to. She is my mate." If I thought the crowd murmured before, it was a thunderous wake of outcries now. A ripple fell across each of the werewolves in the room, and each ripple caused a different effect. Some ripples were innocent and held only confusion. Some traveled further with caution. A select few were cut short with rage. Before Samuel could explain further, the crowd grew restless. A few pushed forward to get a better look at Samuel and me, while others began to retreat. Just as the unrest rose to a climax, another loud voice broke through the panic. "Enough!" the feminine voice called. Following it, the crowd parted. A figure emerged from the center of the room, revealing a tall woman stalking towards the front of the crowd. Her skin was darkly tanned, and contrasting bright blonde hair fell to her waist. When the woman was separated from the rest of the group, she slowly spun in a circle, catching the gaze of each and every soul. Whoever she met eyes with instantly cowered. That is, until she faced Peyton Bray. When her eyes fixed upon him, the room grew cold with Bray's freezing glare. The woman took no heed of it though, and instead let her voice ring through the air once more. "It seems in the wake of devastation this pack has lost who they are." The woman paused and the room stilled. Everyone, including me, held their breaths in anticipation of her next words. She smirked, knowing the room was putty in her hands. "We have lived around humans for decades now. Why is now any different? Why right now do we decide to challenge our leaders and force a divide?" The woman didn't wait for a response, but turned back to Bray and returned his glare. "It seems that some of us have forgotten our place in the world." Suddenly, the woman spun around again. She walked gracefully towards Samuel and me, her chin rising the closer she came. She came to a stop at Samuel's side, nonchalantly blocking me from view. "Beta Samuel and I have this under control. Do your duty to our pack and we will get through the night." As he said, "Everything will be explained in the morning." The woman finished speaking, but the crowd made no movement. They continued to look to her for direction, at which she covertly elbowed Samuel. He cleared his throat, gathering the attention back to him. Samuel looked upon the group with an expressionless face, catching each person's eye and sending their gazes to the ground. "The ones who have thrown our pack into disarray are not with us tonight. The ones who have killed our own are still out there. While we've been wasting time, they are escaping further and further from our grasp. Yes, we've suffered losses tonight. Yes, we are all scared. But we don't have to be. If the remaining warriors would protect their pack, instead of sending them into panic," Samuel suddenly trained his gaze on Bray, "we would all be able to sleep safely tonight." He paused then, letting his words blanket the air. A few people were nodding their agreement, while others suddenly looked as if they would faint. The medical supplies in the room grew heavier, and the toll the pack was taking was suddenly more than apparent. Samuel took a deep breath, sending a sideways glance to the woman beside him. She nodded slightly and he continued. "To those of you who wish to participate, we are organizing a party to hunt them down. You can see Bray for details." Peyton stiffened, and his hands made tight fists at his side. He scowled at Samuel, a pleasant smile beginning to creep across his cold features. "Samuel is right. If you wish to protect the pack, follow me." With his final words, Bray left the room. He disappeared behind the wall of windows, glass doors slamming shut behind him. Several people followed, but a few hesitantly walked up to Samuel. He caught one or two of them by the elbow, spoke lowly in their ears, and sent them after Bray. These select few ran after the group that Bray was now going to lead, the entire time glancing back at Samuel. Eventually, the room settled back into the motions from before. Though the movements were not as frenzied now, people still scurried from one room to the next, carrying medical supplies, crying companions and death-like stares. My gaze was fixed on them for a long moment until it was torn away by the woman at Samuel's side. Really, Samuel? She walked in front of the two of us. Was that the best way to make that announcement? Samuel shrugged. Good a time as any. She rolled her eyes and rested her hands on her hips. Her hard gaze lingered on Samuel for a moment, before flickering to me. Samuel noticed her shift and sighed. This is Samantha, as I'm sure you know. He pushed me forward a bit more. I staggered on my foot, but as soon as it happened, I was pressed into Samuel's again. The woman's gaze dropped to my side, then to my feet. As quickly as it happened, her eyes traveled back up my body and met mine. She seemed to study me as I did her. Her golden eyes burned into me, and I was reminded of another's that looked almost identical. Samuel's voice startled me out of my gaze. Samantha, this is Goldie. She smiled and her large lips thinned slightly. They accentuated her wide-set nose, and despite her overpowering features, she was the epitome of beauty. It's nice to finally meet you, Samantha. Goldie took her hand in mine, shaking it briefly. I gave her a small smile and she continued. But you can call me Carmela. Some of the boys around here think it's funny to come up with ironic nicknames. Goldie sent Samuel a brief glare. Samuel looked at me and shook his head, dismissing her comment and request. He laughed once. Don't blame me. It wasn't my doing. She rolled her eyes. Of course it wasn't your doing. You're perfect, Samuel. He shrugged and shifted his weight, pulling me closer. Goldie eyed the two of us for a moment before pulling her hair up into a ponytail. Samuel took the second to look around the room, only to find the same scene as before. The earlier encounter with Bray had seemingly been forgotten, and the pack was running about its business. Who did you send with him? Goldie suddenly spoke, bringing both our gazes back to her. Briggs and Arthur. Both said they'd keep an eye on him. She nodded. Good choices. I've got Raven guarding a room and she needs help or a replacement, Samuel began, all trace of humor gone from his voice. Sooner rather than later. The shift room? Goldie questioned. Samuel nodded quickly and her gaze darkened. I'll send Nina over there when we're done. She'll help her. How many? Samuel questioned vaguely. 8 so far. And tomorrow? Goldie shrugged. Maybe 12. 11 if we're lucky. Without waiting for his response, Goldie continued. Have you thought about this? About what's going to happen? Samuel stiffened. I've already spoken with Marshall. She scoffed. Load of good that did, I'm sure. Did he roll over when you snapped at him? Samuel was quiet and Goldie shook her head. He's right and you know it. Come tomorrow. I know he cut her off. I'll work it out. I'll fix it. There's nothing that needs fixing. Samuel was quiet once more. His shoulders sagged for the smallest moment before he picked himself up again. Goldie watched his reaction, and I knew she didn't miss his brief movement either. She caught my eye and nodded to herself, then spoke again. Do you want me to take Samantha? If you are asking for you and Riley. He caught my eye, subconsciously tightening his grip on my waist. No, I will take her. Give me a few minutes and I'll be back. I'll need someone outside her door as well. Goldie nodded. Nina can handle both. Especially with Raven to help. She turned away from us then and began to cross the room, following a mass of people. I'll be in the front. She didn't wait for Samuel's response before fully immersing herself in the crowd, getting lost in hurried feet and frantic bodies. Samuel sighed, but I spoke before he could. What was that about? He shifted my weight onto him again and turned down a hallway. I recognized it as the one we'd entered the house in earlier, the one that led to Will's room and a few others. Few things. You don't need to worry. It'll be sorted out in the morning. She was talking about the same thing Marshall was, I prodded, gripping onto his hand around my waist. It steadied me some, erasing the pain creeping into my side. She's his daughter. he said without missing a beat. And the beta female. She knows a few things. My step faltered. Beta female. By this time, we were rounding the corner and closing in upon the hallway of doors. I knew my questions were going to be limited, so I tried desperately to narrow them down to what I knew Samuel would answer, or I could drag out of him. Basically just the female version of my job. She helps me, I help her. Together we help the alpha. I had countless more questions about that, but they each got pushed aside for what was immediately weighing on my mind. What were they talking about? Her and Marshall. Samuel sighed heavily. I told you I'd talk about it later. I resisted the urge to scoff. Right. We rounded a final corner and reached a door. There wasn't anything special about it, as it was uniform with the rest of the hallway. Why did you send Bray off on his own? I asked as Samuel reached for the doorknob. He pushed the door open, pausing at my question. Why wouldn't I? The door swung open and a small room was revealed. Much like the rest of the house, the walls were lined with thick wood and the floor was covered with a fleece carpet. This one had frayed tassels on the ends, a myriad of faded colors lining its design. A small bed lay against the back wall with a window just above its frame. Next to it stood a matching nightstand that held only a broken lamp. Samuel led me into the room, but before we could go any further, I sunk my good heel into the ground and stopped our advance. He turned and eyed me warily, at which I only glared. Why did you send Bray off on his own? He held my gaze for a moment, before dropping his eyes and scanning the room. Eventually, he brought the dark blue orbs back to me and furrowed his eyebrows. He's not alone. We sent people with him. But even then you have to watch what you're implying, Samantha. Why? Samuel looked out the doorway for a moment. Because Pack is family, and family trusts each other. The words fell off my tongue, and silence was left in their wake. Samuel took this opportunity to pull me the rest of the way into the small room. I'm sorry it's not the biggest, he began, gesturing to the room. I just figured you'd want to be closer to it rather than have a large bed. You were right, I told him softly. Samuel walked up to the bed and placed me lightly on its surface. I immediately sunk into the blankets, and abrupt exhaustion threatened to overcome me. I pushed it back for a bit longer though, focusing on Samuel standing above me. What are you going to do? He looked around the room again, avoiding my gaze. Talk with Goldie. See the Pack. Count the dead. Prepare the funerals. Figure out tomorrow. My gaze dropped. I'm sorry you have to go through this. His hand suddenly found my chin, tilting it so that he could see my face. I gave Samuel a sad smile which he returned. It's not your fault. Things happen. I nodded, and before I could ask another question, Samuel continued. I have to go. I'll come for you in the morning. He dropped my chin and took my hand instead. Our fingers intertwined and he traced my knuckles. Please, he paused for emphasis. Please don't try and leave or do anything stupid. There's someone guarding your room, but if you leave, I can't guarantee you'll be safe. Not tonight anyway. I watched his thumb run along the cracked skin of my knuckles. Promise. Chapter 48. It was in the tree line. Samuel left quickly and without looking back. I remained in my position on the bed, sinking further into the comforter by the second. It wasn't only the bed that wanted to swallow me, though. The entire room spoke of comfort and quaintness, drawing me into its soft and warm embrace. Sighing, I leaned against the wall behind me. My head brushed against the side of the window, and absent-mindedly, my eyes wandered to the outside world. Exhaustion was quickly taking its toll on my body, but my mind held back. Almost immediately after Samuel leaving, my thoughts turned to Will. Among all my other questions and demands for answers, I'd forgotten to ask about my brother. I knew he was only a few doors down, but that gave me little comfort. I looked away from the fogged glass to the bedroom door. The wood stood mockingly sturdy and proud. There was no way for me to break through the door, no way to see through even a crack into the hallway. I knew of course that I wasn't locked in, simply that someone was supposed to be standing outside the door preventing anyone from entering. Still I felt trapped. At the last thought I found myself scowling. First at the door, then at my ankle. If I wasn't constantly injured, making any sort of attempt at escape or seeing my brother would be a lot easier. That door wouldn't be as intimidating, and I wouldn't feel as imprisoned. My glare deepened and I shifted my weight forward, gingerly placing my foot on the ground. I put the smallest amount of pressure on it and immediately drew back from the sharp pain shooting up my ankle. As soon as I did, there was a sudden creak outside the door. I whipped my gaze back up to the wood just in time to see the door slowly opening. A small hint of fear suddenly laced my limbs as I watched a figure come into view. The realization that I was in a house full of angry werewolves was quickly falling upon me, along with the recognition that if one wanted to barge into my room and hurt me, I was completely defenseless. Soon, I felt my body tense with anticipation as my heart began to climb. Abruptly, though, the fear was cut short. The figure came into view and I let out a large breath of relief.
Raven, Eastside.
What are you doing here? My hand made its way to my chest, clutching my racing heart. Sorry, she shrugged sheepishly. I didn't mean to scare you. I was supposed to bring you this. She held up a small blue bundle by a white cap. A rag was wrapped underneath it, catching stray bits of water running off the sides of the shiny material. It's an ice pack, she continued, as she shut the door behind her and made her way over to the bed. Marshall said to put it on your ankle. You spoke to him? I asked as I took the pack from her, lifting my foot onto the bed. Raven hesitated for a moment before nodding and sitting on the edge of the mattress next to me. Just in passing. He didn't say anything other than to get you an ice pack. I placed the pack on my ankle, wincing slightly at the contact. When the coolness of the rag crept onto my skin, I sighed. Thank you. Hopefully this will fix it. She smiled lightly. Just doing my job. Let me know if you need anything else. Raven stood and began walking back toward the door. Wait, I called, just as she put her hand on the doorknob. How is he? Will? She turned back to face me. I'm not sure, to be honest. We haven't heard anything from the room since we brought him in there. At this point in the shift, he should be resting. Is it over? I asked, hope rising in my chest. Raven grimaced. No, not even close. My heart dropped. Is he going to lose control again? Not exactly, she trailed off. The physical shifting should be over. I don't know, it's different for everybody. Could come back. And if it doesn't, well, that's when the mental shift begins. I sighed, resisting the urge to massage my temples. Mental shift? Raven nodded, looking uncomfortable. It's what the humans have to go through on top of everything else. They didn't grow up with a wolf inside of them, so their brain has to make room for one or something like that. Okay, I trailed off, searching her features for elaboration. What does that even mean? I don't really know. I'm sorry. All I know is the basics. I've never actually seen a human go through it before. I nodded again, biting my lip as my next question surfaced. You don't think I could see him, do you? If Raven was uncomfortable before, she was entirely out of her element now. Samuel said not to let anyone in his room. I can't disobey him. Her voice heightened slightly. I sighed heavily, sinking back into the mattress. Relax, Raven. I'm not going to try and get you to break me out of here again. She smiled then, sagging her shoulders as if a huge weight had suddenly been lifted from them. Thank you. Don't thank me just yet, I laughed. Not until I can see my brother. Right, Raven rolled her eyes. Let's just make it through the rest of tonight first. Deal. Get some rest while you can. I'll be outside, so if you need anything, just holler. I smiled. Thanks, Raven. She returned the gesture, then slipped through the bedroom door. Once again I was left alone. The room was filled with silence and still beckoned me to sleep. Groaning, I leaned back against the wall and resumed my prior position. The ice pack slipped slightly around my ankle, but I adjusted it and gazed out the window, letting the night lull my thoughts to sleep. It didn't work. No matter how long I sat in that position, no matter how hard I tried, my mind wouldn't shut down. I sat staring out the window, fogged with my breath, for what seemed like an eternity. The night was unmoving, attempting to aid the process of sleep. However, my mind wouldn't shut down. Questions, scenarios, thoughts, worries, fears, and panic attacks tumbled over one another, again and again, forcing out any thought of relaxation. Soon enough, the ice pack had melted, and my back was sore from leaning against wood. I groaned again, forcing my eyes shut only to have them ripped open by another panicked thought. This process continued for several minutes until it was cut short. Just as I opened my eyes to face that panic, though, my gaze landed on something outside the window. I'd been staring into the night for hours, and it had remained unchanged. There was no sway of trees, No disturbance in the silence. Now, however, something was off. I couldn't find exactly where it was that something had changed, at least not at first. After a few moments of scanning the night, though, I saw it. It was in the tree line. The one that Raven, Samuel, and I had driven through just hours before. The cars were still parked off to the side of the trees, doors hanging open as we'd left them. The trees had stayed the same as well. Tall, green, and packed so closely together you could hardly see into the depth of the forest. That is, you could hardly see until something wanted you to. And suddenly, staring at the empty spot between two trees, I felt as if I was meant to see what was there. Yellow eyes. Two of them poking out just behind a gap in the tree line. They were trained on the house, the very window I was staring out of. The eyes never blinked, never moved, and never changed. For a moment, I thought I was imagining them. Then an all too familiar feeling of panic rose from deep within my chest, and I bolted upright with a stark realization. I recognized those eyes. I'd seen them countless times before, each time burned permanently into my memory. As if on cue with my realization, the eyes suddenly moved. They shrank for a moment before bobbing up and down, growing larger and larger. The night hid the creature the eyes belonged to, but I didn't need it to know what it was. Even before the wolf came into view, I ripped my attention away from the window, already falling out of my bed and dashing to the bedroom door. Pins and needles crept up my back as I felt those eyes follow my movements. However, I didn't stop. I crawled desperately to the door, pulling myself up with the handle and ripping the doorway open. The minute I opened the door, I was met with a disgruntled groan. My eyes landed on the man who made the sound and quickly scanned the hallway for anyone else who could help. However, Raven was nowhere in sight, and I was left with the perturbed man. "What are you doing?" he demanded, coming into my direct line of vision. I leaned heavily against the doorway, taking my weight off my now throbbing foot. He stood tall, however, advancing ever so slightly upon my hunched frame. The man stopped in front of me, and I forced myself to stay where I was. Despite his height, the man was lanky and all bone. He was trying to covertly force me back into my room, but with the help of the doorframe I was able to stand my ground. If anything, this annoyed him even more. "What are you doing?" he demanded again, looking me up and down. "You're not supposed to be out here." My breathing was heavy, and I suddenly found it difficult to speak. Where's Raven?" The man scoffed. "The Omega. I sent her to get me a snack." A snack. A snack. I was getting a little hungry babysitting all night, and figured I deserved a reward. She wasn't doing nothing, so I sent her along. My disbelief must have shown on my face, because the man scowled and continued speaking, making himself taller as he did so. "But like I was saying, you shouldn't be out here. Your place is in the room and not out here with everyone else." His tone turned venomous, and I suddenly felt as if he were pushing me back with his words. I raised my eyebrows. "My place?" The man folded his arms, cocking his head. "Do I need to repeat myself? I didn't think humans' hearing was that bad. Guess I was wrong." My mouth fell open. "I'm sorry, did I miss something?" Apparently, he ground his teeth. My temper flared. I opened my mouth to let the insults fly, but I suddenly felt pins and needles up my back one more. I chanced a glance behind me and back into the room, only to find the yellow eyes directly outside the window, bearing down on my back. Ignoring the man, I pushed myself forward, falling into his chest. He flinched at the contact and backed away immediately, raising his arms in disgust. "What do you think you're doing?" the man shouted as I hopped forward, slamming the bedroom door shut behind me. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, drowning out the previous conversation. "There's someone out there," I began. The man cut me off. "Well, of course there's someone out there. Peyton and his guys are searching for the murderers." His tone darkened once more, and he was suddenly glaring at me. Maybe they caught a scent. I resisted the urge to scream. It wasn't them. It was... I was suddenly cut off by a familiar figure making her way around the corner. When she saw me, hunched over and panting for breath, she nearly dropped the plate of food she'd been holding. As soon as I caught her eye, Raven gathered her composure and rushed forward. In one motion, she handed the man the plate and placed her shoulder under my own, supporting my weight. "What's going on?" she asked me slowly. "I told you, the white ones," the man suddenly cried, shoving the plate into Raven and my faces. They were out, Raven replied so softly, I almost didn't recognize her voice. The man grumbled and dropped the plate half-heartedly into a chair across the hall. Get her back in her room. Raven nodded, but before she could move, I was pinching her arm against me in protest. Wait, I hissed, and as soon as I did, her movements stopped. She tilted her head towards me, so I continued in rushed words. He's out there. Right outside my window. Who? What are you talking about? She shifted toward the bedroom. I desperately tried sinking my good foot into the ground to halt her movements. However, before I could speak again, the man was interrupting us. This is ridiculous. Get back in the room. Stop making a scene. Before I could stop him, the man pushed past Raven and I and into my bedroom. As soon as the door opened, I flinched back involuntarily, but the moment I did, silence filled the hall. My heart stopped beating and no one moved. There was nothing there. Samantha, Raven started. Like I said, the man interrupted again, turning back around to face me. He glared, and the expression sent ice down my spine. Making a scene. Haven't you done enough damage tonight? I bowed my head in defeat and confusion. He was there. I swear he was. The man snorted. Right, and Alpha Riley's alive. This ain't Fantasyland. Get in the room and don't come out again, hear me? Raven silently stepped forward, and this time I didn't protest. The man walked behind us and back out into the hallway. He reached for his plate, and as soon as he did, an idea struck me. Raven, I began in a small voice. I feel lightheaded. Can I get some water? Her step faltered, but she quickly sat me on the bed and began to retreat. Of course. The man in the hallway rolled his eyes. Bring her a sedative while you're at it, Omega. Raven nodded, bowing her head and moving out of sight. The door was left open for her short return, but the man was no longer paying attention to me. His gaze had shifted to the plate of food he was picking through, placing pieces of various meats and bread into his mouth. Ever so slightly, my head turned to look out the window. Sure enough, with the door completely open, the yellow eyes hadn't returned. I shifted my weight on the bed to get a better look out the window, searching for any evidence of their appearance. However, there was none. The night was as still as ever, the trees undisturbed, and the car doors safely shut on the trucks outside the house. Chapter 49. Living Hell. Waiting for Raven to come back was like waiting for a never-ending storm to subside. The atmosphere of the room was swirling with flakes of fear and apprehension, clouding together with memories of the figure outside my window. The eyes could back at any minute, any second, and I would have no hope of defeating their owner. The storm would climax, and I would be left in the wake of its destruction with only the yellow eyes to comfort me. Long moments passed. With each one, my heart rate climbed higher. Humming filled my ears until it was the only thing I could hear. My eyes shot wildly around the room for a distraction until I realized the humming wasn't coming from my fear. It came from outside my room and traveled down the hall until it met my ears. Soon, I deciphered the growing humming to be a chorus of voices. They blended together as easily as the earlier storm of my room, each voice rolling around each other until their words were indecipherable. The only thing I could understand was that they were growing louder. The man outside my room perked up. He stopped eating and tilted his head to the side, narrowing his eyes. What's going on? Called out. His narrowed eyes caught my glance and he sneered. It's not your business. Stay here. The man rose from his chair, letting the plate of food fall from his lap. His hurried footsteps echoed down the hall, retreating to find the source of the onslaught of voices. I pulled myself off the bed and muttered, like hell. I limped as quickly as possible down the long hallway. My hands gripped divots in the walls for support, and around every corner, I paused to search for anyone who would stop my endeavors. However, the hallway was empty. I didn't see a single soul until I emerged into the main room. There I found the source of the humming. The room hadn't changed in the short amount of time I'd been absent from it. Like before, a large crowd gathered, interspersed with furniture in various rooms. Doors stood ajar with people flooding out of them, and yellow lights contrasted greatly to the moon shining outside. However, unlike before, people weren't moving. They stood clumped together, speaking in loud voices and staring at a spot at the end of the room. My gaze followed theirs until it fell upon the wall of glass windows. The door leading outside was wide open and a small semicircle formed around it. A figure moved into my line of vision, and I immediately caught their arm. Raven, what's going on? Raven pulled herself from my grip, glancing at the crowd. I'm not sure, but it doesn't look good. Let's go. She grabbed my arm and began pulling me away. Wait, I hissed, earning several glares. Raven stopped pulling my arm just long enough for me to catch a movement on the other side of the room. A door opened and Samuel's tall figure emerged. He wasted no time in pushing his way through the crowd, Goldie tailing behind him. The room parted around the duo, needing no more than a glare from Goldie to create a path. What's going on? Samuel called, breaching the semicircle which framed the door. When he reached this point, however, he too froze. Goldie followed suit, and suddenly the crowd grew louder. I was able to decipher what they had all been murmuring just moments before, but what they spoke did little to comfort me. Instead, it sent icy daggers shooting down my back. Who is it? A woman called, and another, where did it come from? One man closer to the front door. I heard a knock and found her there. Finally, one familiar voice rose above the crowd. Leave, Goldie called, piercing the protesting crowd. Back to your rooms. Back to your jobs. Like the grass bending the will of a breeze, the crowd began to move. They retreated without a second thought, following Goldie's orders as if their very lives depended on it. Then again, catching her dark glare bearing down on each and every soul, it probably did. Raven moved with the crowd. She again pulled on my arm, but I was rock solid. While searching the room, my gaze had fallen upon Samuel. He turned his back to the door and was now facing me with a look I couldn't quite decipher, at least not at first. His eyes were filled to the brim with emotion, more than I had seen in days. His body was tense and unmoving, but one hand was extended in front of him. Almost unconsciously, he was reaching out, calling me to come closer and ease the emotion surging within his soul. Then it was gone. Samuel's hand retreated and his face paled. He shoved through the dispersing crowd, a frantic glint in his eyes. Long legs stalked toward me, and for a moment, I wanted to turn and run. Then that moment passed, and a stark realization fell upon my shoulders. Something was wrong. Samuel reached me the very moment that thought rang through my mind. Completely ignoring Raven, Samuel grabbed my waist and turned me away from the glass door. Before I could protest, he was leading me back down the hallway to my room. Raven was left behind and soon disappeared into the crowd. Stop. I pushed against Samuel, digging my feet into the ground. I gasped as a sharp pain shot through my ankle. Samuel paused at this, and I took the opportunity to pry myself away from his grasp. What's happening? He looked me up and down once, then twice, then again. The earlier frantic light was now fused within his dark eyes. We need to get you back to your room. I can explain there. No, I refused, folding my arms and dodging out of his reach. What did you see? Samuel's mouth hung open with the words I wanted to hear. However, he never spoke them. He only looked at me once more with those dark eyes. Without waiting for the response I knew would never come, I pushed past Samuel and stalked back into the living room. It was emptier now, with only a few souls lingering in the doorway. Goldie was among them. She turned to glare at the person who dared defy her order, but then her eyes met mine. Just as soon as she saw me, her gaze darted to Samuel, and understanding blanketed her expression. She moved into my field of view, just as I was closing in on the door. Desperately, I tried sidestepping her, but she caught hold of my shoulders and held me in place. Samuel came up behind me, replacing her hands with his own. What's going on? I cried out as Samuel pulled me backward. By this point, he was only halfway holding on to me. I could pry myself away from his grip just as I would a small child. And I did. I continued yanking my arms out of his reach, throwing off his attempts to hold me back. Samuel, Goldie began. Let her go. Samuel hung his head and his arms fell limply to his sides. Goldie eyed me with sudden pity, stepping aside to clear my path to the door. My eyes darted between the two for only a moment before I pushed myself forward. When my gaze fell upon the doorway, my heart turned cold. There, lying in a mangled heap just outside the door, was a body. Blood covered almost every inch of skin and torn clothing. Brown hair fell across their face. Twig-like limbs were bent at awkward angles, bending and folding around each other. They were broken in almost every spot and dark, purple bruising covered the areas not coated in blood. The body was so deformed that upon first glance, it didn't even look human. But it was. I knew it was. I knew it because it wasn't just any body. It wasn't the form of some unfortunate woman that fate decided to send to their demise. No, it was a body I knew. It was my mother. I didn't have to push aside her dark hair because I knew exactly what features would lay beneath. Her eyes didn't have to open because I knew they were the same color as my own. There was no need for closer inspection because this disfigured heap of skin and bone was the same person I'd spent my life with. This was the woman who raised, comforted, healed, and guided my entire world. And now she was dead. I don't know how it happened, but the next thing I knew, my knees buckled and I was on the ground. My palms fell forward, bracing my body until they gave way as well. Before I could fall, thick arms caught me and held me upright. A sick and crippled sob escaped my lips. Other noises sounded around me, voices calling harshly to each other. Feet moved, and before I knew what was happening, foreign hands lifted my mother's body. My hand reached forward to join them. Shaking fingers fell upon her cold shoulder, and the blood that was caked on my mother's body spread onto my fingers. The moment I realized the body was real, the other hands lifted it up and out of my vision. I flinched forward, both of my arms grabbing for what was left of my mother. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw several figures carry the lifeless form away. The moment I twisted to go after her, she disappeared through one of the hallways. My feet launched me forward, but the hands under my arms were merciless. They pulled me back and planted me on the ground without entertaining hopes of leaving. A series of broken sobs left me. I had no hopes of keeping them inside. At that moment there was no control. The only thing I could think, the only thing I could see was my mother's dead body. The arms pulled me closer to someone's chest. I pushed away, but my efforts were fruitless. Still, I didn't stop. My hands tore at those holding me. My legs kicked blindly in the air. Hot tears ran into my open mouth, screaming at whoever was holding me to let go. But they never did. They carried me away from the door, away from my mother. Soon the walls around me changed and the floor grew softer. When I stopped fighting long enough to see where I was deposited on my bed, and Samuel's looming frame sat next to me. He called out my name. When I didn't respond, the hands returned, only this time they wrapped around my waist. I stopped struggling at this point, knowing that they wouldn't leave until they wanted to. They wouldn't leave me alone. They wouldn't let me see my mother. They wouldn't let me fight. They nor their owner cared what I wanted. I heard my name called again. Upon recognizing Samuel's voice, I whipped my gaze up to his. He was staring down at me with sorrow-filled eyes. His lips continued to move, speaking comforting words and drawing me nearer. As his voice entered my brain, something willed me to calm down. It tried to lull me into his comforting tone and allow his hands to hold me the rest of the night. Then I remembered my mother's body. My hands pushed again against Samuel's chest. He hadn't been expecting it this time, and I got away a fraction of an inch. When his voice stopped and I met his gaze again, I snapped. The immediate attack of grief abruptly turned to hot, searing anger. "This is all your fault." My voice was low at first, but it rose with every word. He let me go at this point and I tore away from him. I pushed myself up against the headboard, leaving him sitting on the other end of the bed. Samuel stared after me with confusion at first and then understanding. He hung his head. "I know." My chest was heaving and tears began pouring faster down my face. "No, you don't. You don't know a thing. How could you know? How could you?" He looked at me at this point, eyes brimming with water. When he opened his mouth to speak, I cut him off. "Don't. You can't say anything. This is your fault. Why didn't you let me go? Why did you come after me? Why did you let this happen? Samantha, you're what? You're sorry. That doesn't fix anything. That doesn't fix the fact that my mother." My voice broke off as another sob racked my body. Samuel reached for me, but I shoved his hands aside, taking a deep breath. "That doesn't change the fact that my mother is dead. You said you'd find her. You said she'd be fine. You lied. None of this would have even happened if you weren't hell-bent on making my life miserable." Pain filled Samuel's features. "I never wanted that. I just wanted you to be happy." "Do I look happy, Samuel?" I breathed heavily, my voice growing louder. The only people I have in this life are dead or about to be. He paused, then almost too soft to hear said, "You have me. I don't want you." Samuel flinched, then nodded, as if he'd been expecting this answer all along. He closed his eyes. This wasn't supposed to happen. No, it wasn't. My family was supposed to stay safe. That was the deal. If I loved you and made you happy, then they wouldn't get hurt. My voice trailed off, but my ramblings were cut short. "What are you talking about?" I shook my head, fighting back sobs. "I did everything I could and they still got hurt. I did everything to keep you happy and not argue and be a good mate. But it didn't matter. My mother is dead and Will is either dead or a monster. And you know what? If you weren't here, if you didn't come after me, if I didn't have to live my life pleasing you, then my family would be thousands of miles away by now." Another sob tore through my body, cutting off my rant. Samuel didn't try to touch me again. He was stiller than stone on the other end of the bed, staring at me with what I was sure was anger. When I raised my gaze to meet him, though, I could only see sorrow. "Is that what Riley threatened you with?" "Don't you pity me, Samuel," I started again, drawing in a deep breath. "Pity yourself. Because of you, my life is a living hell. This is all your fault. Don't you dare tell me otherwise." My voice had lowered to nothing more than a whisper, but I knew he heard me. I knew because, after a moment of silence, his body slumped forward. He caught his head between his hands and shook it back and forth in agony. "I know," he eventually whispered. "Then leave." His head lifted a fraction of an inch. "What?" "Go. Leave me alone." Samuel stilled for another moment, then began rising off the bed. His back was turned to me when he stopped and tilted his head. I never stood a chance, did I? I closed my eyes, resisting the urge to clutch my chest. Never. Chapter 50. He cares. Samuel left. Just as I'd told him to. He didn't waste another second before he trudged out of the room and closed the door with heavy fingers. I barely paid attention to the rest of the night. What was once a warm and inviting room had now turned cold. The yellow eyes that plagued my mind just moments before could no longer hold a place in any part of my consciousness. I was completely overcome with the image of my mother's dead body, forever burned into my heart. The night was spent crying. At some point, I drifted into a fitful slumber tormented with images of dead bodies. Each time I awoke, another round of sobs would attack me. This continued for torturous hours, until I finally gave up on sleeping and accepted the dark. Tears came silently then. The sun crept into my room, inch by inch. The light turned from the pale colors of sunrise to a harsh glare, shining through the window into my dead eyes. It beckoned me to come outside and experience its warmth and bathe in its life. I stayed in bed. I curled myself deeper into the blankets, cocooning my body so that I was safe from the outside world. If I never left, I wouldn't have to face what happened. I could stay forever in my respite and peacefully waste away. As time went on, the sun cast mocking shadows across my room. I could hear voices and movements throughout the house, but I had no desire to follow them. This wasn't needed though, as they came to me. Each time the sun would move a few inches, footsteps would draw nearer to my door, and occasionally it would creak open. I never bothered to look up to see who it was that came into my room, and likewise the person disturbing me never made a noise. They would simply open my door and deposit food next to my bed, then leave without uttering a syllable. The day dragged on. By the end of it, a pile of food, ice packs, and medicine had accumulated next to my bed. Like everything else, I ignored it. My eyes simply stared at the walls, not bothering to see my surroundings. My thoughts followed suit. They entered into my mind, but when I did little to dwell, they left. In their wake was a numbness encasing my body. The room was bathed in the orange light of sunset when the door creaked open once more. However, unlike before, the person who entered lingered in the entryway. "You haven't really eaten anything," Raven cleared her throat. My eyes focused for the first time that day, scanning Raven once over. Her hair was pulled up and it accentuated the anxious light flickering within her chocolate eyes. When she caught my glance, she smiled. I pulled the blankets back over my head. I heard her sigh. "I brought some tea. It's what I usually drink when I'm upset." She settled herself at the foot of the bed. The blankets welcomed her as their own, pulling away from my face as they did. She peered around the cloth to attempt another look at me, but I turned away. It's really good if you give it a try. Not too heavy so it won't make you sick or something. A warm cup was placed on the sheets, next to my hands. I stared at steam ascending from the brown liquid, feeling the additional and unwanted warmth invade my cocoon of blankets. When I continued ignoring her, Raven's shoulders sagged. I'm not allowed to leave until you eat or speak, whichever comes last. Her words rooted their way into my mind, and before I knew it, I opened my mouth to let out a raspy groan. Go away. There. I could hear the smile in her voice. You're halfway done. She shifted, pulling the blankets further away from my face. I glared daggers at her hopeful expression. Raven's face faltered, and she bent her head. The image of her sitting at the foot of my bed, defeated, brought back memories of the previous night. Not the horrific images that plagued my dreams, but the reality that carried just as much weight. A picture of Samuel, shaking his head in agony, made its way to the forefront of my mind. I tried ignoring it like I'd been successfully doing all day, but with Raven sitting at the bottom of my bed, continually reminding me, the image refused to pass. A weight began to settle on consciousness. It dripped into my soul like a leaking faucet at first, before it advanced as a raging storm. Then everything hit. The numbness I'd succumbed to the entire day cracked away, and its place was every emotion I'd tried to suppress. Each one tore at my heart as a gust of torrential wind, ripping me in half time and time again. Raven stared at me, watching the battle rage. Her eyes drooped and she licked her lips. Do you want to talk? My mouth pressed into a firm line and I shook my head. She nodded and pushed the mug of tea closer to my hand, warming the skin. I lowered my gaze and took hold of the cup, embracing the added warmth it provided my suddenly cold body. Drink. It'll make you feel better. Raven raised her own cup to her lips. I mimicked her actions, letting a small sip of the brown liquid enter my mouth. It was sweet and instantly livened my senses. See. I sighed and gave a slight nod. She smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. It's okay, you know. When I was silent, she continued in a soft voice. It's okay to hurt. The tears I'd been fighting began falling down my cheek, dripping into my cup. I opened my mouth, but words refused to come out. Raven saw this and slowly reached her hand toward mine. Can you sit up? I nodded, blindly following her request. As I did, Raven placed her cup on the floor, replacing it with another ice pack. Here, take this. Before I could protest, she took my cup away and placed the ice pack in my hand. I looked at it for a moment, before moving away countless blankets and fixing it gingerly over my swollen ankle. The purple skin was met with immediate relief. I sighed, then slowly brought my gaze up to Raven, raising an eyebrow. You're not getting rid of me yet. She pointed her finger at the pile of food beneath us. You have to eat first. My gaze fell on the food and my stomach churned. I licked my lips and cleared my throat. I'm not hungry. She smiled. Then I guess I'll be here a while. I sighed. The deep breath caused a coughing fit to rack my lungs. Raven quickly gave me the mug of tea, at which I took a grateful sip. When it was finished, I placed it back on the ground and gave her a sympathetic look. You can leave, Raven. I'm sure Samuel won't care if I eat or not. She shrugged her shoulders. Well, it's a good thing Samuel isn't the one who told me to come in here then. When I met her statement with confused silence, Raven continued, smirking. I can think for myself sometimes. But you said I know. She laughed softly. I made myself a rule that I couldn't leave until you ate or drank something. I stared at her for a moment before an unwilling smile crept onto my face. Won't they notice you gone? Everyone is a bit preoccupied at the moment. I nodded, adjusting the ice pack on my ankle. Raven looked at it for a moment before twisting her fingers together and pulling on her shirt, glancing in my direction. Samuel spoke to the pack this morning. It was a pretty good speech. I'm sure it was. I bit my lip as the earlier weight pushed harder on my chest. I'm surprised he isn't down here with you. And just like that, the storm came back, tearing me apart once more. I'm not. Raven paused, her nervous twisting. What do you mean? Nothing. The air grew heavy in the room, and I knew what Raven was going to say before she whispered. Something obviously happened. You want to talk about it? No. Raven resumed, twisting her fingers. Was it your mother? She took my silence for her answer and continued. I'm so sorry. I can't imagine. I know you said you didn't want to talk, but it helps, really. She hesitated before asking her next question. How did Samuel handle it? I bent my head, no longer deluding myself with the notion that Raven would let me ignore this reality. I took a long sip of tea before responding. Fine. Did he say what happened? No. She narrowed her eyes slightly. Does he know why? I doubt it. Raven tilted her head. Did he say anything? I took a long breath through my nose and closed my eyes. I did most of the talking. She nodded, content with that small piece of information. I'm sure you needed comforting. A sudden knife pierced my heart as I remembered Samuel's arms wrapping tirelessly around me. Without them, I would have collapsed and never walked again. Did he tell you about this morning? Raven continued her slew of questions. I shook my head. I haven't seen him since last night. Oh, she paused, debating her answer. Did something happen? I would have thought he'd be here, she trailed off. Again, Raven took my silence for an answer and gave me a sad smile. I'm sure he'll come soon either way. He cares for you. I broke my gaze away from her as another surge of tears fell from my eyes. No matter how I pushed them away, they fell along with my whisper. That's the problem. What do you mean? She gave me a side glance and began patting my extended leg. My voice was shaking. He cares. I don't think that's a problem, she trailed off. I shook my head, bringing sudden trembling fingers to my face. You don't understand. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she emphasized, did something happen? For a long moment, the only noise in the room was our breathing. Raven's question turned over in my mind again and again, until I couldn't come up with the words to answer. The question was simple, and so was the response, but no matter how I tried, I couldn't utter a word. I'm sorry. You don't have to tell me. Raven eventually broke the silence. I think I understand, and I'm sorry I brought it up. Sometimes things just don't work out, I guess. She raised herself from the end of the bed, patting the blankets. I'll go now. I didn't try to stop her. The remainder of light quickly faded from vibrant red and orange to a dull dimness blanketing the room. I'd been left with my thoughts for hours now, and unlike before, I couldn't numb them away. They continued torturing me until there were no tears left in my eyes, no strength remaining in my limbs. However, I couldn't find it in me to care to move. I couldn't find it in me to care to even think. The problems that haunted my consciousness only the day before were now insignificant. What did it matter who took my mother? What did it matter who killed Riley, who bit Will? The latter would probably not survive. The other two were already dead. And lastly, the only one that I might have had left in the wake of all the devastation, I'd pushed away. Darkness encompassed my room. The last light of day had faded, and I was left with nothing more than a cold moon glinting through a dirty window. Almost unconsciously, I pushed the blankets from my body and removed a now melted ice pack from my ankle. My legs slipped off the bed, my injured ankle landing on the floor last. To my surprise, the pain wasn't nearly as intense as the night before, and I was able to walk. So I did. I walked straight to my bedroom door, and with only a moment of hesitation creaked it open. The hallway was deserted. I expected to find Raven or the man from the previous night, but there wasn't a soul in sight. Without waiting for one to appear, I slipped out of my room, trudged down the hall. I went opposite the direction of the main part of the house and made my way deeper into the maze of doorways. It only took a few minutes and several lucky turns to reach my destination, a shining metal door. Specifically, the door was locked behind. Not to my surprise, the door was sealed shut. I tried it time and time again, but with each yank of the handle, the only thing accomplished was exhaustion. After pulling on the door for several minutes, my feet slid out from underneath me, and I collapsed on the ground. Tears and silent sobs tore through my body, as once again, grief overcame my senses. But this time there was no one to lash out at. This time I was utterly alone. I remained outside Will's door the entire night. No one came to find me. After Raven left, there was no need. They were all off in their own parts of the house, mourning their own losses. My own was only a drop of water compared to their ocean. A small, insignificant drop. Swift footsteps echoing down the hall was what woke me. It took some time until they reached Will's door. But by the time they did, I knew to whom they belonged. Samantha. Samuel's deep voice confirmed my knowledge. I raised my head off the floor but stayed sitting in order to avoid looking at him. My voice came out gravelly and almost as low as his. Samuel. His frame was stiff. Raven suggested I give you breakfast. I put it in your room. My room is down the hall. I know. I was coming to check on Will. I shifted, keeping my gaze planted on the wall, unsure of how to respond. Samuel answered for me. I'll come back later. His footsteps began to retreat. Again, the loneliness of the hallway surrounded me, and before I could stop myself, I called out to him. At my voice, Samuel paused, then turned back around. He waited for me to continue, but I couldn't find the words. My gaze stayed trained on the wall and I bit my lip, forcing back the tears I thought had subsided. What do you want, Samantha? Samuel's tone was harsh. His words stung. In response, I stuttered over my own. Everything I spoke was incoherent and meaningless. When my voice died off, silence filled the hall, much heavier than before. Despite the knowledge that Samuel was only feet away, loneliness crept in, along with the image of him sitting at the end of my bed, broken. Then came memories of my spitting voice and accusations, throwing him over the edge into a pit of agony. The heavy weight filled my chest once more. When I looked up, Samuel was gone. He left me outside Will's door, with nothing more than I deserved. As I watched him plod down the hall, a piece of my heart that I hadn't known existed was torn in two. Another hour passed. Just as I was debating returning to my cocoon, another set of footsteps came trotting down the hall. Tentatively, I raised my gaze to face their owner. Golden hair flashed into my vision, just before Goldie spoke. What are you doing out here? She stopped just in front of me, standing close enough so that I had to tilt my head back to see her. When I met her gaze, I flinched. She was glaring at me, clear displeasure lacing her sharp eyes. My heart skipped a beat, and I lowered my gaze. Leaving? Don't leave on my account. I hesitated, flicking my eyes up to her. She had her hands on her hips, and the glare was etched deeper into her face. Instead of responding, I rose to my feet and pressed my back into the wall opposite of her, inching back down the hallway. Her voice stopped me. Where is your guard? I haven't seen him since yesterday. Goldie was silent for a moment. I chanced another glance at her, only to see she was pinching the bridge of her nose. Him. Confused, I nodded. She shook her head in frustration. This is getting ridiculous. Her voice trailed off. Just as it did, her eyes snapped back up to mine, narrowing. You shouldn't be walking. What? I said you shouldn't be walking. On your ankle. Marshall will kill you. My eyes fell on my foot. It was still discolored, but it hardly hurt. I'm fine. I'm sure you are. My mouth fell open, but again no words would come out. Goldie continued glaring at me, and when I couldn't take it any longer, I sank back into the wall. I'll just be going now. Don't you want to see him? I stopped, my gaze darting back to her. What? Do I really have to repeat myself every time I speak? She rolled her eyes. Do you want to see Will? Well, I mean, of course. But what? My shoulders raised as my hand searched the air for an answer. I didn't know I could. Goldie rolled her eyes again. That is why I'm here. To let me see Will. She shook her head. To check on him. I just figured you'd be here too. Then why do you want to see him or not? She snapped. Instead of answering, I began walking back to where she stood. When I came to her side, I gripped the wall for some sort of support. She dug into her pocket, and a moment later forced something into Will's door. The steel elicited a series of clicks before it fell silent and opened a crack. Goldie held the door, glancing back at me. He's stable and should be fine. Don't provoke him. I nodded, but she still didn't let me through. I brought my gaze up to meet hers, only to see her brow furrowed. I'm serious, she continued, holding my gaze captive. Samuel will kill me if something happens to you. I shook my head and mumbled. I'm sure. I know you don't like him, but believe me, he will care. He always cares. My eyes were firmly planted on my feet now. I waited for Goldie to open the door for me, but she stayed in place, holding me hostage outside. After a silent moment, she snapped. Her hand fell away from the door, but instead of opening it, she closed harshly. She huffed out a breath and landed her hands on her hips. Do you? Do I what? I could almost hear her eyes rolling. Care. I bit my lip. Flashbacks of all the moments I had been asked that question swam in my mind, And my initial impulse was to answer with what Goldie wanted to hear. But instead of giving in to the impulse, I fought it. I had nothing else to lose. Riley was no longer threatening my family, but that didn't even matter. My mother was dead. Will was already a wolf. There was no more leverage. Nothing more tying my hands and forcing me to answer appropriately. Nothing except how I truly felt. Goldie noticed my hesitation. After a moment, she sighed and resumed her previous glare. Never mind. I know how you feel. Without waiting for my response, she unlocked the door and began to retreat. Lock the door when you're done. Don't let the story end. Subscribe to continue our wolf pack legend.